Welcome to the Our Lady of Perpetual Help podcast series, recorded live at Our Lady of Perpetual Help Catholic Church in Ellicott City, Maryland.
The vigil in Easter, or the Easter Vigil, is one of those times where we see salvation history laid out before us. And one of my favorite names for the Bible and how the Bible speaks to us is God's love letter to us, the way in which He shows His love to us throughout the generations, throughout the peoples, drawing them to Himself and bringing us into the story of salvation, into His divine love, into His divine life. But if you look at the Scriptures, sometimes it's a little confusing, a lot of pain and sorrow and fear, destruction and distress, disaster. The first reading, we see Abraham called to sacrifice his son Isaac. In the second reading we read, we see the Pharaoh chasing through the Red Sea to bring about the destruction of the Israelites. In Isaiah speaks to a people who have been exiled, left, taken from Jerusalem, talking to a divided kingdom, broken up, maybe, seeing the temple rebuilt, but then it destroyed again. And then, even as we enter into the time of Jesus, the Roman occupation, not what they would expect from God, the God who promises them peace and freedom. Even as we see Jesus, the Messiah, He's crucified on the cross, conquered, at least seemingly, by the oppression He was supposed to free us from. But that's what flips it all on its head, the way that God enters into the world. God doesn't stop the suffering in the moment, but turns that suffering into salvation. If we look at it through our lens of knowing who Jesus is and why He has come and what we hope in, we see, instead of this hard ask of Abraham, as God showing Abraham what He intends to do for us into the future with Jesus. Literally, Abraham lays the wood of the sacrifice on Isaac. Isaac is that foreshadowing of who Jesus will be. And of course, Abraham, giving everything in trust of God's promise, is rewarded and called the father of faith. But it was still difficult for him. The Israelites, being in slavery for 400 years, being pursued by Pharaoh, seeing all the destruction prior to that, and in the fleeing, it's good to recognize that the same love of the Lord was for Pharaoh as it is for the Israelites. But if you stick clay in the sun, it hardens. And we hear multiple times that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And if you stick butter in the sun, it melts. The disposition of our hearts is where that different comes from, that free choice that Pharaoh chooses to be hardened, where it could melt and draw Pharaoh and the Egyptians to himself. And so that hardening of the heart is what leads ultimately to Pharaoh's destruction. The Isaiah, we see this people who had been broken in time and trial through sometimes, multiple times, their own faults and falling back into idolatry and not trusting the Lord. But Isaiah lays it out and says, I will lay gems in your wounds. The ways in which you've turned away from me, I will place rubies and sapphires and carbuncles, literally laying gems in the wounds of their suffering. And then, of course, in Jesus Christ, the fact that God enters in. He doesn't stop the suffering in the moment. He enters into it. He is there. He's present. He is God and man, able to enter into that reality in which we experience in our suffering. And so as we look at our present day struggles, as we look at the world today, we see the epidemic, the pandemic of the coronavirus, ways in which many people are divided, we're isolated, separated from our community, at least physically. Thanks be to God for the technology that allows us to be together here tonight. They actually set up pictures of you in the pews, which is awesome, and we really much appreciate all the people providing those pictures for us to remind us how much you love us and how much we can, long to see your faces, even if it's just a picture in the pews. Reminds us of your love for us. But God enters into that suffering. Many people might ask, where is God as the death toll rises in the United States above that of Italy? Where is God in this? He's right there, suffering with us, in the nurses, in the doctors, in the children, in the parents, in the grandparents, in the suffering. He's there to welcome those who have died into the eternal kingdom. He doesn't take the suffering away, but he transforms or allows that suffering to transform us so that we can be saved, making the cross the instrument of our salvation. And so as some might say, where is God? We know where God is. He's right here. He's with us, in our brothers and sisters, in our hearts, in the love that we share for each other, and of course, here in this church, not just this building, but in his people, in the body of Christ. Today, the light of Christ enters into the darkness to remind us that he is always that pillar of fire leading us, just like he led the Israelites through the desert, just like he led them through the Red Sea. He's still leading us here today, in this moment, in this time, in this pandemic. We see in the gospel fear, maybe fear that we're experiencing now. The fear of the soldiers that are struck, almost looking like they're dead. The angel says, do not be afraid, to Mary and the other Mary, speaking to us as well. Jesus says that more often than anything else. The angel saying it here first, saying that God is not dead, but he is raised. He is alive, and he's going to meet the disciples, the apostles. And then, as they go, Jesus actually appears to them. Presumably, he was already going where he was going, but he came back to be with Mary and the other Mary. And he says the same thing, do not be afraid. And they're fearful but overjoyed because they have the hope of who Jesus is and what Jesus turns that suffering, and that suffering for them was real. Jesus' death is real. The suffering that he endured was real. But he enters in and turns and transforms that suffering into joy, into the hope of the eternal. Not taking away that suffering, but transforming it into our salvation. So, on this Easter Vigil night, as we continue to celebrate in this different way, in this best way we can, God is here with us. And he's telling us the same thing he told Mary, the other Mary, and the apostles. Do not be afraid. I am here with you always.
Thank you for listening to the Our Lady of Perpetual Help podcast series. We invite you to visit our website at www.olphparish.org to get connected with everything our parish has to offer.